Thank you for streaming Cities After, a radical exploration into the capitalist contradictions of our urban world and the many anti-capitalist futures to come. This is a Democracy at Work broadcast, and I'm your host, Miguel Robles-Duran. In this episode, I will discuss the elitist, conservative, and contradictory pseudo-movements that have seized control of all discussions regarding cities, housing, and urban development, from community organizations to developers and politicians. I'm referring to the not in my backyard or just in my backyard pseudo-movements and their politics, or better known by their acronyms, NIMBY, YIMBY. In my view, the politics that spawn from both of these are a major roadblock to creating just and equitable urban spaces, perpetuating systemic inequalities and hindering true progress. I believe it is crucial to aggressively confront and dismantle the capitalist politics behind these pseudo-movements in order to establish socially just strategies that move beyond the current stalemate. About a month ago, while scrolling through my daily newsfeed, I stumbled upon a Fortune magazine article that blamed America's decline on those who subscribed to the not in my backyard ideology, more commonly known as NIMBYism. Unsurprisingly, the article was just another poorly written piece in support of the just in my backyard ideology, or YIMBYism. This coming from a magazine that has long prioritized serving the interests of the capitalist class, corporate elites, and big businesses. This was a trash headline. It's bigger than the housing crisis. An influential economist just blamed NIMBYs for American decline, and Elon Musk agrees. This headline perfectly represents the striking socio-political contradictions reinforced by the NIMBY-YIMBY dichotomy. According to the story, NIMBYs, or not in my backyard people, are staunch elitists who block progress by resisting change and innovation, while YIMBYs, or just in my backyard people, are promoters of growth, inclusivity, environmentalism, affordability, and prosperity. But do they truly embody these characteristics? So before I delve further, I want to first give you a little bit of history. These two concepts originated in the 1980s from the United States waste management industry, where YIMBY emerged as an opposing viewpoint to the obstructive tendencies of NIMBY and its protest that often impeded the successful establishment and operation of vital waste disposal facilities. It is really unknown when the terms were initially used, but the first mention of NIMBY in the New York Times was in 1983 in an article about Colorado farmers rising against a hazardous waste site proposed near their land. 5 years after, in 1988, the New York Times published another article titled Coping in the Age of NIMBY, referencing a company called Environmental Systems and their proposal to build a toxic dump facility in Orange County, California. And they proposed that this could be moved on flatbed trucks. It is said that this company, through this proposal, coined the acronym answer to NIMBY as YIMBY, which was originally short for Yes in Many Backyards. This 35-year-old article effectively illustrates the emerging NIMBY phenomenon, so much that I feel it is important to cite a part of it. And I open quotes. This is the age of the NIMBY. Developers of everything from hotel and airport extensions to soup kitchens and McDonald's restaurants have met the NIMBY squads. NIMBYs are noisy. NIMBYs are powerful. NIMBYs are everywhere. NIMBYs are people who live near the corporate or government projects and are upset enough about them to work to stop, stall, or shrink them. NIMBYs organize, march, sue, and petition to block the developers that they think are threatening them. They twist the arms of politicians, and they learn how to influence regulators. They fight fiercely, and then, win or lose, they vanish. NIMBYs, many industry analysts say, have become a new American business life, a new force in American business life that could push the country towards an unprecedented economic paralysis. In the abstract, most studies show Americans want growth. They just do not want it near them. End of quotes. Another thing this article does is introduce the concept of NIMBY as a syndrome, as an American illness that is costing a lot of money to businesses and corporations, causing extensive delays for projects of all types, and imposing unreasonable burdens on companies that are striving to compete globally. Thinking about it, this might have been the moment when urban development corporations and industry-driven planners nationwide began to suddenly experiment with many of the pro-business, collaborative, and participatory approaches that we are familiar with today. Of course, hijacked from grassroots movements and advocacy planning propositions of the previous decades. The intention was simple: to persuade communities of the benefits that came with their infrastructure, environmental, housing, or industrial projects. Engaging communities earlier in the development process could improve the palatability of their proposals and help negotiate more profitable ventures, and in turn, avoid costly legal, political, and media fights. It is important to note that in these early conceptions, the NIMBY mobilizations were mostly associated with fighting projects that were believed to cause social and environmental harm. Whether it was a gas pipeline, a toxic dump, a garbage incinerator, or a housing development or a highway. However, it would be a mistake to consider all their manifestations to be for the social good. The term NIMBY becomes more contradictory and politically perplexing at this juncture. Depending on its actors, its intentions can be conservative, racist, exclusionary, and elitist. Or it can strive for social equity, environmental justice, economic solidarity, and public inclusivity. For instance, some historians consider redlining and other forms of urban segregation to be direct precursors of the dark side of NIMBYism. And from the brighter side of NIMBYism, Jane Jacobs' famous 1960s winning battle against New York City's planning commissioner Robert Moses and his top-down plans to build a highway across Manhattan's West Village is considered to be another precursor. But let me illustrate these contradictions with more contemporary examples. As I speak, NIMBYs in the wealthy beach community of Huntington Beach, California, are fighting a recently passed state legislation mandating that municipalities sanction the construction of accessory dwelling units and duplexes in single-family residential areas, and implement feasible strategies that indicate suitable locations for constructing new, affordable, and market-rate housing. But despite repeated warnings from state officials, the Huntington Beach City Council arrogantly defied state laws, voting against the development of backyard housing units and duplexes in single-family zones, denying housing opportunities to its residents. What's more, the council plans to brazenly dismiss applications filed under the builder's remedy provision of state law, which allows developers to construct projects that violate local zoning laws, provided they meet affordable housing criteria. But this is of no concern to the unsympathetic council that refuses to take constructive action to address the shortage of affordable housing. To contrast this example, a few months ago, another type of NIMBYs staged an 11-day occupation and protest of a mixed-use development in what used to be Vice Memorial Hospital parking lot in uptown Chicago. The protesters, who established a grassroots front called Rise Uptown, composed by a broad coalition of human rights activists, unions, nonprofits, and community associations, expressed their frustrations over the development being marketed as luxury, despite the lack of affordable housing options and the rise of homeless population in the area. The group is trying to block the development as they advocate for plans that prioritize the provision of more affordable housing options and address the root causes of homelessness. Rise Uptown argues that development plans must directly involve residents, and greater community input is necessary to guarantee that the needs of residents are met. The protesters placed tents in front of the development as a symbolic move, drawing attention to the high levels of homelessness in the area. The group is among several other NIMBYs in Chicago that are advocating against luxury real estate developments across the city. So these two examples show how and why "not in my backyard" commonly has opposing meanings, and it is precisely this contradictory character what has made it into an effective political tool that neutralizes any opposition or resistance to urban development. This by turning it into a derogatory syndrome that attacks progress. This trend has made NIMBYs widely unpopular and seen the term become a pejorative and an insult that symbolizes backwardness. There is no denying that the notion of NIMBYism has had a profound influence on urban planning and development, where its immediate use today is labeled as an obstacle to housing affordability and has thus enabled politicians, policymakers, and developers to easily dismiss neighborhood-level pro-social justice democratic dissent that opposes their crony development policies, and of course, blame them for the housing crisis. And since today's media landscape falls easily for scapegoating and simplistic arguments, this negative categorization of NIMBYs has become status quo. Just for the fun of it, let me illustrate this with a series of recent news headlines. Take this one from The Times, Britain's oldest national daily newspaper. NIMBYs are the real reason your children can't buy a house. How about this one from CNBC? A "not in my backyard" mentality is hampering progress on renewables, Hydro CFO says. Or this one from the Toronto Star. Want cheaper housing in Toronto? Show up at a community meeting to drown out NIMBY voices. Or here's a final one from the Daily Mail. Not in my backyard. Worst celebrities NIMBYs revealed. So, even though historically there have been countless instances where NIMBY opposition movements played an essential role in protecting vulnerable environments and communities from extreme gentrification, pollution, and the negative impacts of brazen capitalist development, the phrase is now considered toxic, and therefore it is used in political discourse, and it often leads into its presumptuous dismissal. This has resulted in situations where opposing any urban development, regardless of the socio-environmental damage that the project could cause, it almost always is met with ridicule and accusations of NIMBYism. Undoubtedly, the term NIMBY has become a common political mechanism used to also silence the voices of those who seek a more collaborative, democratic, and socially just approach to urban development. One has to ask, who is benefiting the most from the blanket political resignifying of NIMBYs? In this light, racist white beachfront dwellers and affordable housing grassroots activists are categorically the same. The feature that equalizes them is their opposition to any profitable development from real estate or infrastructure building corporations, their design industry, and the politicians that serve them. And that is all that matters. So what about their opposition? You know, the yes in my backyard people, better known as YIMBYs? Well, contrary to the NIMBYs historical association with pro-environmental, anti-gentrification, and urban justice movements, the YIMBYs have a tighter historical association with real estate developers, extractive industries, and environmentally destructive businesses. Of course, all political positions can fit both terms. And this is why they can only be useful to those that can profit from their extreme ambiguity. Loosely put, yes in my backyard advocates seek to address the growing housing crisis by promoting policies that encourage the construction of more and more housing units. In order to achieve this, YIMBYs often support looser regulations and changes in zoning laws that would allow for increased density in urban areas. They are driven by the belief that the simple action of increasing supply of housing units will drive down costs. In short, all power to developers. The YIMBYs' simplistic approach has not only failed to recognize the root causes of this crisis, but also perpetuates a harmful trickle-down housing policy that prioritizes luxury developments over affordable housing options. YIMBYs' refusal to acknowledge corporate landlords and their exploitative practices and the developers' demolition of rent control apartments and, of course, mega landlords further highlights their lack of concern for the great majority of the population that cannot afford a home. Instead, the movement insists that flooding the market with more apartments, irrespective of their affordability, will solve the crisis, displaying blind faith in the free market economy to address a systemic problem. This is something that I talked in depth in an episode titled The Problems with Supply and Demand in the Housing Market. If you haven't listened to it, I strongly recommend you put it in your playlist. What I talked there is directly connected to this episode. So, as Rico Cleffy, a journalist of the Brooklyn Rail, puts it, this movement, and he's referring to YIMBY, coalesces around a pro-growth agenda and a strict adherence to basic tenets of neoclassical economics, supply and demand. Or as Erin McElroy of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, who is cited on Cleffy's article, refers to all the YIMBYs and their approach as all housing matters. The YIMBY forms of operation are not only misguided, but also downright dangerous. Intentionally or not, they threaten to worsen the existing disparities by pushing out low-income individuals from their homes and neighborhoods. In my view, those that are pro-development, like many millennials that are frustrated with the current housing market, must deepen their understanding of the issue and advocate for ways out of the crisis that prioritize affordability and, most importantly, hold negligent landlords, corrupt politicians, and greedy developers accountable. But clearly, this is not what is happening. On the opposite, if anything, the political YIMBY agenda has been very successful assimilating well-intended and seemingly progressive younger individuals. For instance, in an article from the left-leaning newspaper The Guardian titled "Rise of the YIMBYs, the Angry Millennials with a Radical Housing Solution," spotlights YIMBYs as a group of young progressive activists advocating for increased housing development in their cities. It goes on by explaining how YIMBYs see housing supply as the solution, especially in areas that have seen limited development in the past. However, the article notes that despite YIMBYs' good intentions, their emphasis on increasing housing supply might have unintended consequences, including displacement of long-term residents, the elimination of historical buildings and neighborhoods, and potential gentrification of previously affordable areas. Arguing that without being fully aware of this, the YIMBYs' younger driving force are actually serving the needs of the middle and upper classes, rather than addressing their own needs and the critical requirements of low-income households. These are two short excerpts from the article. The YIMBYs see themselves as progressive housing activists. Critics call them stooges for luxury developers. Their willingness to lobby for market-rate housing in traditional minority neighborhoods has seen them called techie gentrifiers and developer stooges. Their penchant for market-based solutions has seen them called libertarians with trickle-down economics. One thing has become very evident from this debate. YIMBYs, young, middle-aged, or old, are not to be mistaken for housing justice activists, despite their attempt to gain such credentials for political reasons. This is something that California-based housing justice organization called Housing is a Human Right has been saying for years. And is citing their long struggle against the real estate industry to substantiate this claim. For example, they explain that during the drafting of a California land use deregulation bill called SB 827, the housing justice movement staunchly opposed YIMBYs and the bill's attempt to unleash luxury housing developers and gentrify working-class regions. The following up bill, called SB 50, was met with the same resistance from activists, putting YIMBYs in a political bind that led them to impersonate and co-opt housing justice messaging and movements. However, despite the YIMBYs' attempt to co-opt the housing justice movement and join housing justice collaborations, they showed their true colors in two crucial housing justice battles. During Proposition 10 and Proposition 21 ballot measures, which sought to repeal and reform statewide restrictions on rent control respectively, YIMBYs sat on the sidelines and refused to back the housing justice movement. These actions revealed YIMBYs' true interest, tacitly backing big real estate instead of fighting for truly equitable housing propositions. According to Housing is a Human Right, YIMBYs' attempt to gain housing justice credentials are nothing but political posturing. As their actions reveal, they are more concerned with advancing the interest of big real estate than fighting for equitable housing policies. This cynical collusion between politicians and the real estate industry is eroding already fragile communities and exacerbating the affordable housing crisis. Of course, with developers dictating policy, Neighborhoods are being decimated, and tenants are being displaced from once affordable homes. Even worse, the trickle-down housing agenda perpetuates dangerous and false assumptions, namely that simply building more luxury housing will somehow benefit low-income residents in the long term. Despite this, many left-leaning politicians have been publicly manifesting themselves as YIMBY and have been approving market rate/luxury developments, basically arguing that new expensive housing is better than no housing at all. This is the simplistic talking point that YIMBYs have been using all along to gain mainstream support. By now, they have successfully co-opted progressive-minded millennials, but also progressive politicians, including some that belong to the Democratic Socialists of America, better known as the DSA. Needless to say, this open contradiction has provoked a rupture amongst many on the left political spectrum. A recent article in New York Magazine titled "The YIMBY War Breaking Out on the Left" details the increasing conflict between YIMBYs and NIMBYs on the progressive front. While politicians that lean YIMBY advocate for more development to address the country's housing affordability crisis, other NIMBY leftists oppose new construction, citing concerns such as gentrification, segregation, and displacement, and have been calling out their YIMBY political allies as sellouts. Ultimately, the article frames the conflict as a fundamental disagreement about progressive urban development. But what this article and so many others that I have read on the matter tell me is that progressive politicians are being co-opted by YIMBYs because they have failed to imagine, propose, or advocate more radical approaches to housing affordability and equitable urban development, many times ignoring the myriad of grassroots propositions that have been put on the table for them to support, such as non-speculative, limited equity, and cooperative housing models, rent control mechanisms, redistributive taxation, legal protections, legal actions against abusive developers and landlords, and community-controlled land banks. As a matter of fact, industry YIMBYs don't support any of these community-proposed progressive development proposals. By opposing policies designed to level the playing field and mitigate the uneven power dynamic between landlords and tenants, they continuously expose themselves as agents of gentrification and displacement. They are not interested in a more equitable or sustainable urban development or environment. As we all know, they are concentrated on advancing their own capitalist interest, and the YIMBY movement has served them very, very well. As I take it, the mainstream's YIMBY's obsession with deregulation and unmitigated development and their reckless disregard for the consequences of uncontrolled development has emboldened developers to build luxury housing in marginalized neighborhoods, further exacerbating social inequalities. And despite being called out by housing justice and tenants' rights activists, YIMBYs and all its co-opted supporters remain steadfast in their allegiance to the interest of developers, turning a deaf ear to the voices of vulnerable, low-income, and middle-income populations. Their bullying tactics and aggressive behavior on social media against any sign of NIMBYism have only served to deepen the divide between the movement and those fighting for housing justice. To those progressive voices that subscribe to the YIMBY ideology, and I know some of you listen to Cities After, you must come to terms and acknowledge the contradictions at play in the NIMBY-YIMBY dichotomy. Recenter your social purpose and work towards protecting marginalized communities, bringing forward their proposals, and continue to advocate for their rights. And this instead of subscribing to a pseudo-movement that has been lining the pockets of developers? Why not invent or join a real urban movement that is transparent in their justice goals, democratic, inclusive, and participatory in its goals? If you have followed the last 3 episodes of Cities After, I hope that our views coincide in that market-driven supply and demand solutions proposed by YIMBYs are not going to ameliorate the fundamental problem of housing affordability, which we know is rooted in fiscal injustice, income inequality, financialization, and speculation in the housing market. It's time for a long overdue paradigm shift in the disassociation from NIMBY, YIMBY, and its paradox. My conclusive argument for this episode is straightforward. Not in my backyard, and yes, in my backyard, or NIMBY-YIMBY, should not be part of the progressive lexicon of urban action and housing activism. Let's leave those to the capitalists, and most importantly, fight them, because we can do better than capitalism.